Hello, everyone. I'm Sean Rehag. I'm the director of York University Center for Refugee Studies, and I'm also an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's CRS seminar, where we are hearing from Professor Ahmet İçduygu. Professor İçduygu is from Koç University in Istanbul. He holds dual appointments in the Department of International Relations and the Department of Sociology. He is also the director of the Migration Research Center of Koç University. He has expertise in a number of areas that are connected to his talk today, including in migration studies, in citizenship, in international organizations, in civil society, in nationalism and ethnicity, and in research methodology relating to migration. He's going to be speaking to us today about a set of issues connected with a return in protracted refugee contexts, using the specific example of Syrians in Turkey as a way to think about this question. So this question is obviously one of the hot topics at the moment in migration and forced migration studies. So I'm grateful, Ahmet, that you've joined us today to talk to us about this issue, and I'm looking forward to your talk. So over to you.
Sorry, well, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I had a little problem now. I can start. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to take part in this seminar series of the Center for Refugee Studies at York. Let me already, when I'm introduced, actually, I will talk about the return question of these refugees under the protracted refugee situation. The case study here is Syrians. And in the last couple of years, actually, even a bit, maybe just longer than that, it's becoming an issue in Turkey for a long time. In fact, when the Syrians started arriving in Turkey, also, very beginning, this return issue came to agenda, scholarly agenda, also of course, public agenda and policy agenda. Let me start actually with the kind of present day question, just to provide a kind of background. And the last couple of days, actually last 10 years, we are very much interested in what's happening in Ukraine, particularly in terms of this mass flows going to neighboring countries. And since the very beginning of this development, actually, on media and policy circles, we see that there's strong reference to the temporary protection. I will mention that later, but in Europe, there's a kind of arrangement under the European Union. Even in the case of US, so when the country is welcoming these mass flows, actually the concept of temporary protection over and over start to coming to the agenda. I thought that I should send a kind of reference to this as a kind of case issue. As I already mentioned, that since what happened in Balkans during 1990s, in 2001, European Union developed this temporary protection directive, providing when the mass flows happens, providing accept a kind of protection to the refugees. There's something between asylum seekers and refugees. They put a kind of time dimension and giving certain rights. And again, in European circles, actually, concerning this Ukrainian refugees, this is discussed in the last couple of days. Why I started, because in the case of the Syrians in Turkey, we also use the legal sense that there are people under the temporary protection regulation. There's a law dated 2013, and based on that, in 2014, actually, particularly referring to Syrians, there's a kind of detailed regulation giving a kind of status to the Syrians under the temporary protection. So let's keep that in mind. What I would like to do in this talk, briefly, I will refer to concept of protracted refugee situations, but arguing that these refugees under these situations deals with the question of temporariness, what we in certain literature, we refer to them as this is a permanent temporariness. This becomes a kind of issue also. So-called durable solutions are discussed: return, local integration, and resettlement to the third countries. And when the protracted refugee situation comes to a certain stage, I will give the example of Turkey. Return the base, as I argue, even the very early stages of this mass flows, return issue comes to the agenda, but later, empirically, I will show that the particular last 3-4 years, this is hotly discussed in a very specific context. So after this introduction, I will just briefly refer to some theoretical analytical issues. I mean, literature very briefly, where I am putting this discussion of the refugee situation, particularly with the question of mobility, immobility issues. Then I will come to my discussion on the Syrians in Turkey, how they experience this question, and I will try to draw some conclusions from this discussion. I should mention that this is not a presentation of a full paper. In the last couple of years, I'm working on the return issue. I published some articles, but this is a kind of new study I'm trying to develop with certain more interviews with the Syrians. Very quickly, in certain part of the world, of course, the many refugee situations turning into protracted refugee situations, particularly in the region where I live, also concerning, for instance, Afghans in the almost last 40 years. In Iran and Pakistan, just they formed refugee communities there. And particularly in the case of course, Syrians now more than 10 years, not only in Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon, and the scholars, policymakers argues that the solution in Syria is not at the end of the tunnel. So probably for coming years, this time will pass, and more we will have that kind of strong protracted refugee situation in the case of Syrians too. And what one may argue that, of course, the protracted refugee situations presents a kind of state of limbo. Often this, again, I will refer to the conventional durable solutions. Okay, there are different options, integration issue and the resettlement issue in the third countries at the return. I just at the beginning, as I said, I mean, in the last, in my center also, we are conducting different research on the Syrians. But as I said, in the last couple of years, particularly, I'm focusing on the return issue. I put here the 2 quotations from the interviews with the Syrians. When we look at these 2 of these quotations, actually, what we see that the Syrians themselves, the refugees themselves, also aware of the fact that they are living under the climate of the uncertainties. That there are different options for them. One is staying in Turkey. The other is some of them argue that their relatives living in other countries like Germany, they may go there, or their children may go there. But also there's reference to this Turkish government, I will mention in detail. There's this discussion of return to the so-called safe zone. So this is a kind of what we can get out of this two interviews. They complain about this uncertainty, but also I will argue partly that this gives some opportunities to them. So for their future, at least they think that there are certain options they can play with them. Let me go to some analytical theoretical discussion very briefly. I will focus on, as I already mentioned, that when we refer to protracted refugee situations, we are referring to an environment of uncertainty, and the question of temporariness, the concept of permanent temporary is often discussed in the literature. In any case, when we refer to refugee lives, this is there's this time and location discussion related to time and location is very important, theoretically and empirically, of course. Again, I will come to this how my refugees themselves perceive these three options. In general, I mean, because I have some interest with the Afghans also in Turkey, they're coming from Iran and Pakistan or directly from Afghanistan, but mostly my data comes from the case of Syrians. Local integration creates a kind of what I may call recently I published something with the using the concept of vulnerable permanency. They feel that they will stay long time, but they are quite vulnerable in the local integration process. And the resettlement issue, again, we know that it's not working very well, almost no and little prospect for the resettlement. Of course, there are some lucky refugees, if they like, I mean, they can have the opportunity of resettling in North America, Canada, US, or Australia, or some European countries too. But in the case of Syrians, I will give some figures. Giving the large population of Syrians, actually, one can argue that this is not working. But return issue is always in the agenda of the policymakers, the states, plus of course, particularly if the refugees living close to their own countries, like in the case of Syrians at the border area, this return issue also quite alive in their minds. And overall, both the return issue and local integration and resettlement often comes to with the question of mobility and immobility, because the refugees themselves, they don't have a kind of legal tools or resources, although they like to move, and it becomes a kind of issue of mobility and immobility from their side, but also with the policy in the eyes of, or in the practices of the policies too. I mean, just time to time, the different policies, they can mobilize them in such a way. Sometimes they, of course, often stop them to go from one location to another. Without repeating the same thing, actually, I put here, but my main question here in this talk, actually, how one can relate the return question to the question of mobility and immobility within a protracted refugee situation. As I said, that since the beginning is, I will play with the case of Syrians in Turkey. Now, to provide a kind of larger background to the discussion, this graph shows what happened in the last 12 years or 10, more than 10 years, 11 years. Many of you probably know that even from distance. At the beginning, there was a open door policy, assuming that the size of the flow will be small. Often at the policy level, the government officers say that, for instance, time to time 100,000 is a kind of red line, or 200, and they reach to the 250,000. But in fact, in the first 2 years, this relatively, when we look at the large size of the community today, only 250,000 arrived, less than that. But Turkey was welcoming, but the arrangement was very informal. Turkey had the new law in 2013, but although this came after the Syrians arrived, which is not a product of when the Syrians came. Actually, so for a long time, the Turkey's refugee regime dismissed the new legal arrangements, etc., new policies, very much debated in the context of Turkey's membership to the EU. So before the actual starting with early 2000s, in the context of the Turkey's accession to the EU wanted a kind of harmonization of the Turkish asylum law and the migration arrangements. So this law is a kind of product of that long discussion with the EU. So nothing directly related to Syrians, what I mean. The first a kind of formal regulation came in 2014. So within first 2-3 years, of course, the main concept used that they are our guests, or a kind of brothership, as referring to religion. Then the expectation of that kind of footnote to you. Turkey had a kind of very interesting experience in the 1991 when the almost 500,000 Kurds came to the Iraqi border from the Iraq, and the Turkey opened the border after closing it actually, but they stay only few weeks and months, then they return to northern Iraq. So with that experience, the expectation was that there will be a kind of solution in Syria, that they will return soon their home. So the expectation was a bit not for the kind of long-term crisis type of discussion. Then after the 2014, what we see, 13 particularly, what we see that the numbers rise at in 2015, almost the number arrived to 2.5 million. And again, remember that what happened 2015, the so-called refugee crisis or migration crisis in Europe, when the Syrians to Turkey, not only Syrians, also Afghans, arrived through the route from Turkey to Greece and to Europe. This was a kind of turning point, actually, the discussion of the Syrians can stay in Turkey longer term. So what we witnessed that after the 2000 event, the first work permit regulation came to the active actually, with a limited scale actually. So we see that the Turkish government taking some measures. They think that this is turning to a kind of long-term settlement, or a kind of there's no prospect for the short-term stay. There was the Turkey-EU deal in 2016. You know that in those years, those days actually, what we see that also, strangely enough, that it started with an informal talk of the President Erdogan. Turkey started offering citizenship to the certain selected Syrians. When I say selected, government, actually, Syrians cannot apply, this is not the case, but the government brings some offer to the more educated Syrians, or some Syrians with the capital, businessmen, etc. It's not a transparent process, but I will mention that later anyway. Then again, starting with the 2018, we see the kind of time I use it a kind of U-turn from the earlier positions, but the suddenly return debate increased, partly in the election times. Also the Turkish public start to show rising reactions to the presence of Syrians. Then we see that the time to time this intensified return debate come to the agenda since then actually. But I will give the example. In fact, from the beginning, I will give some details to that. Turkey wanted to create a kind of safe zone in Northern Syria and keep the Syrians there or return the Syrians. I will come to that discussion. Now, quickly, I will focus on that how these three options going on in relation to Syrians. Resettlement issue. Just I'm checking my time. As I said, when we talk about the resettlement, of course, the nearby geography is Europe. Since the 2015, when this Syrian refugees, as the large numbers started arriving in Europe. There was this EU-Turkey deal. EU-Turkey deal opened a kind of window to the resettlement, but we know that it didn't work within this great kind of problem among the EU member states. Briefly giving the numbers, really, I will show some numbers here. What we see that the resettlement in Europe is not possible. Very small numbers. Of course, there are some. I will show the figures that there are resettlement in North America, in Australia even, but the numbers, as I'm referring it, is not too many. And this issue becomes between the EU and Turkey is a kind of instrument for a long time. Actually, all different types of migration issues, a kind of bargaining issue between EU and Turkey politically over the last 2 decades. As the top point was, of course, 2016 EU-Turkey deal, but the main purpose of this deal was, as many of you probably remember, that to stop the flows. The flows declined, but whether this the impact of this agreement or not, it's open to debate. As I said, the one important conclusion of this deal was the resettlement, but it did not work here. I will show some figures here, which gives the resettlement from 2014 to 2021. Actually, as you see that there are two different types. There are on the right side. Actually, in the right side table shows within the 2016 deal, there was this one-to-one deal. If there's one return of Syrians who informally arrive in Europe, in Greece, actually, the person will return to Turkey and the one person will resettle in Europe. But overall, you see that the overall number is on even less than 30,000. And when we look at the resettlement from Turkey to other parts of the world, including Canada and US, again, this is the figure coming from the Turkish authorities, 2014, 2021, only less than 17,000 Syrians, they were able to actually settle in other countries. This is not visible, but I already showed this figure now. Currently, those Syrians under temporary protection total number is 3.5. Over that, even though there are some unregistered ones. Increasingly, they are living, of course, in the cities. Almost now, probably only less than 2-3% of them, they are living in camps. This shows the actual distribution of the Syrians in Turkey. As you see that most of them, there are concentrations in the border areas. Also big cities like Istanbul, Izmir, and Ankara. In Istanbul, there's 500,000, but when we talk about the Syrians in Turkey, we are talking about the urban refugees, in fact. Different cities affected in a different way, but there are majorly 10-15 cities, mostly they are affected, some of them hundred thousands of people. One of the border town, which is the Kilis with Syria, actually half of the population is Syrians, the other half is the local people there. So just, I'm trying to give a kind of what is going on in terms of the integration aspect of the Syrians here. Again, here I try to develop some type of argument that this temporary protection issue, this temporariness and integration, also in the literature seen as a kind of contradictory things. Although in reality, of course, we can think of that although these people live under this title of temporariness, even if they feel the temporary, there's a kind of spontaneous integration is going on. I mean, they live there, they establish their lives, children go to school, they open their businesses, what we may call the a kind of spontaneous integration. But as I said, we have in Turkey some Turkish government is very shy in that sense because seeing the public reaction, although there are some arrangements towards this integration aspect, such as the offering citizenship at the quite limited size, limited scope is limited, but the work permit, of course, the children going to school. In brief, actually, what I called there is a spontaneous integration with those policies together, but of course they live in a very poor conditions. Particularly COVID period very much affected these communities. Okay, I think I have some figures on that. Let me go quickly. I will touch upon some figures. What is the picture with the Syrians in Turkey? Over 150,000 Syrians got the Turkish citizenship. As I already mentioned, that they cannot apply to get it, but the offer goes through a kind of selection. Over 500,000 Syrian babies born in Turkey. Why this? Of course, they go into the labor market, informal labor market. But unfortunately, although there's this type of regulation on the work permit, again, they cannot apply for the work permit. Employers and the only 10% of a workplace could be Syrians. So vast majority of them, they are in informal market. But every city you can see that in the factories, in workshops, or time to time they open their shops. So very much you see that they are also within the economy. Still, there are problems with the formal education. It's considered that still 1/3 of the children at schooling age, they are not in the formal education. This number is improving actually in the recent years. We have more than 100,000 Syrian students at the universities. So many entrepreneurs from Syrians actually, if you go around in the big cities or small cities even, you see that those shops open at even the small size, even 1 or 2 big size businesses, they open that. There are different research showing that their interaction with the communities. Here, just quickly, I like to pass through saying 2 things. One is that the survey shows that still half of them, for instance, having no or little Turkish. But I like to mention this. There are surveys, of course, whether type of questions, whether they will stay in Turkey, go another place, or return intention, their decision on the staying in Turkey or going somewhere. As you know, that these type of surveys results are quite questionable. But just to give a kind of idea to you, over the time, when I look at the earlier surveys, nearly 45% of them used to say they stay in Turkey somehow, and often in survey, 45% of them, if things improve in Turkey, in Syria, they indicate that they will return to Syria. The 10% in the early surveys, they used to say they like to go to elsewhere out of Turkey. Now what we are seeing, that the increasing numbers actually is showing a kind of tendency to stay in Turkey, and those who are indicating they will return to Syria, the proportion get less and less, but also the number increasing that those who are having the intention to go somewhere else outside Turkey and Syria. Now coming to what is discussed in terms of this return question. First, I will look at from the policy side what the Turkish government trying to do. actually recently I'm trying to look at the government discourses, what happened in this last 11 years. Maybe I did not put here, but since the very early period, Turkish government bringing this idea of safe zone to the agenda, or to the international agenda, I should say. Here, an important footnote, of course, why Turkey very much involved in Syria politically. The main question, I think, is this Kurdish question there. I mean, security perception of Turkey towards the Kurds, and the Turkish government wants to control the border and even those activities of the Kurdish groups. Since the beginning, this was one of the important, I think, the important cause why the Turkey was so much in Syria. But particularly starting with the 2015-16, even Turkey prepared this map, and I think this was either 2017 speech of the Erdogan in the General Assembly of UN. He showed this map. Even Turkey planned different towns. Even the argument was that Turkey will construct with the money coming from outside sources some new towns, and the two things actually said that still there's a possibility of new flows to Turkey and to other places. So to stop the new flows from Syria, plus to return the Syrians from Turkey to those regions. When we look at the region, actually, it's it's a kind of play, the area of where the big powers playing their games, including US, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and of course one of the major player is also the Kurds there. Relatively last 2 years, actually, particularly in the COVID period, this region is stable. I mean, there's not big clashes there. But Turkey in the last 5 years developed almost 5-6 big military operation, almost occupying this certain regions here, the quite large region. Often this creates a kind of tension between Russia, Turkey, between US and Turkey. But together with the big powers, actually, we see that the Turkey controlling the area, almost creating its own de facto safe region. It's argued that way. What happens since the beginning, this is a kind of example. Of course, this border was in the, let me say, Cold War period. This border was mined. There was a kind of tension between Syria and Turkey in the father's Assad period. But later, just before during the early 2000s, then there was a kind of new development, and Turkey and Syrian governments, they became very close to each other. But traditionally, anyway, this border is because this very artificial border there. Even the borders, time to time, it divides the same towns together. The people, the relatives, those people living in Turkish side, they have the relatives, friends in the other side. And this is a kind of picture that even before this crisis period, in the religious holiday period, the government opened the border, they can visit the other side. Even this crisis period now, even Turkey was less controlling this region. Each year twice they open this border and they can go to but increasingly this is becoming the case. Syrian refugees, they are recorded, they go there and they come back. Some of them in that process, let's observe that they stay certain, even the longer than the permitted period. So there's a kind of floating population formed there, what I mean, but also some municipalities, this is a kind of picture, some municipalities are in the last 2-3 years, they are developing a kind of what is called the voluntary return program. They are initiating this return of the but the fifth year we see that my observation is that not many, but symbolically, Turkish government trying to give, or the municipalities actually in the hands of the current government, they are trying to give the impression that there are returns to this safe zone. This picture shows that, and let me, because time is passing. Okay, when the Turkey controlled that region, actually, we see that they are constructing the schools for Syrian children, but what we see that they introduced Turkish language courses there. For instance, children there, even they celebrate Turkish national days. Turkish post office opened their branches there. Turkish lira became a kind of currency in those regions controlled, or I can say occupied by the Turkish forces. But coming to this, what is obvious that the Turkey trying to argue that there's a kind of return of the Syrians going on. Time to time they give this number of 450,000 already returned. But myself, experts and the international observers arguing that this is a very much exaggerated number, maybe a couple of 10,000 actually they arrived somehow there, but nobody knows actually. Overall, international committee from these three countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, they only mentioned that a couple of 100,000 return. But in the border regions, of course, we can think of their floating population going and coming back. What will I will argue that when we look at the whole picture, of course, the security is not there yet. There are clashes, so no one can argue that there is security for a kind of for return program. We can think of a return. I will show that also. Already I showed this to interviews, and I will show some more. When we interview the Syrians, also they feel not to return to this safe region. Mostly here I should stress that they know that almost this is a kind of internal displacement. Many of them returning to, if they return, few of them will return their own home or their own lands or homes, original places. This is a kind of what is going on from a kind of engineering going on there. So we see that the refugees themselves also not so keen to currently return them to this so-called safe zone. I will, actual time is passing. Yeah, I have some 5 minutes. I will go, only 5 minutes I'll spend. But what I'm trying to do, I mean, as I said, I'm trying to write something, and I look at some earlier cases of this safe zone in different refugee situations, such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, and Bosnia. Here, what we can observe that, of course, proper, quote-unquote, proper return programs, the international support, the UN involvement is very important. Of course, this has the pluses and minuses when we look at those cases. But this UN involvement is very important variable there. The other thing is that the foreign involvement, as we are seeing now in Turkish case. The other thing is that the time of the return, whether during in time to time, we see that in these early cases, during the crisis, during even the conflict period, the return programs could be on agenda. But probably more ideal one, of course, the return in the peace process. Just I want to show that so we have the earlier experiences of the return, but all of them, in fact, showing that this field is quite complicated. Since my time, again, limited, when I just evaluated my interviews here, as I already showed it earlier, these are the coming also for more recent years. Again, I will repeat myself what I said earlier. What we observe, refugees, the Syrians, they they are having a kind of spontaneous integration. This is happening here. I mean, some of them, they say, okay, we live here for a long time. We are our students going to school and they can stay. But the others refer to their relatives or friends, other places. So resettlement is still an option, but many of them, I never have a kind of person really favoring this return to the so-called safe zone. Here I can draw that conclusion. Okay, now I think I can move to my conclusion already. I think I give some sense of what I'm trying to say. This simultaneously at the policy level also, we are seeing this integration issue in Turkey. The government having certain policies, but partially seeing the kind of public reactions, they are very shy also. Of course, since Turkey's involvement to the Syria, also its political involvement, also somehow brings this idea of return there as a kind of political tool, a kind of demographic engineering there in the region. Resettlement in the case of Syrians, little or no, in fact, and there is now in front of us a challenging return question. A kind of footnote, this return issue not only discussed in Turkey, but in European countries also discussed. The case of, although very, the numbers are not big, for instance, in Denmark, the return and Denmark considered that Syria is a kind of safe place, and there was last couple of years there are debates on the returning the Syrians there. Yes, overall, probably I did not go to that detail, but from my interviews, what I see that also agents of refugee is very, very clear in those interviews. So although they live this in the environment of uncertainties, but they know that there are certain options and they play with these options, while the structure and institutions of this international refugee regime put some certain limitations on them. But we see that play between those dynamics and mechanisms of the international refugee regime operating in this geography, and they try to establish their lives under these conditions. Well, thank you very much. I will stop here. And probably I should. Do you think maybe I should stop my my presentation here?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor İçduygu, for your presentation. From my perspective as a scholar interested in refugee and forced migration issues in Canada, it's a very interesting time to hear about thinking about kind of permanent temporariness and return in the Canadian context. There are ongoing debates about how to respond to refugees and others who are displaced by the conflict in Ukraine. And one of the very interesting things is that the policy responses that the Canadian government has reached to so far have been different from the policy responses to other groups of refugees, including from Syria and from Afghanistan. And one of the distinguishing features is actually an approach focused on temporariness. And so whereas the Afghan and Syrian refugees who came in very small, constrained numbers through resettlement programs, but they did get access to a form of permanence, permanent residence, and ultimately citizenship in Canada. And what's being proposed for Ukrainian folks who are displaced is more temporary protections. We won't control the numbers, we'll have essentially unlimited access, but we're not going to have folks who come in automatically gain access to permanent residence or to citizenship, and watching this and knowing a little bit about what has happened in countries like Turkey, who host far larger number of refugees, and who initially approached this with the idea that this was something that was going to be temporary. In virtually all of the examples where that's happened, temporary has proven to be far more permanent than anyone anticipated. So I'm grateful for you taking the time to help us think about some of these issues by looking at the context of Turkey and Syria. So what we're going to do now is we've got some time for questions. If anyone has questions, they can, you've got two options. You can use the raise hand function and ask your question that way, or you can put your question in the chat. Does anyone want to start?